Moses had his hands around Clayton Briggs's throat in the flooded rice paddies when the overseer finally stopped thrashing. The water was chest-deep and black as ink, and somewhere in the darkness, Moses could hear the frogs calling out like witnesses to what he'd done. He'd waited 23 years for this moment, planned it through 1,000 sleepless nights, but nothing prepared him for the weight of a dying man or the way the Mississippi mud sucked at his feet as he held Briggs under. Tomorrow they'd find the body floating near the irrigation gates, and by then Moses would be miles gone, following the drinking gourd north toward a freedom he'd only heard about in whispered songs. But tonight, with his wife's blood still fresh on their cabin floor, and Briggs's last breath bubbling up through the murky water, Moses became something the plantation had never seen before. A man who chose his own fate even if it meant drowning in the choosing. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Greenwood plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Mississippi Delta flatland, and every inch of it was built on the backs of the 247 souls who worked its rice fields from sunup to sundown. The land itself was rich, dark soil that could grow almost anything if you knew how to manage the water. But that richness had been purchased with blood and suffering stretching back 3 generations. Master William Thornton's grandfather had established Greenwood in 1798, bringing the first enslaved people from the Carolinas to clear cypress swamps and build the infrastructure of rice cultivation. By the time Moses was born, the plantation was a well-oiled machine of exploitation, every aspect of its operation designed to extract maximum labor from human bodies while providing minimal sustenance to keep those bodies working. Moses had been born on this land in 1832, delivered by his grandmother in a cabin so small you could touch both walls by stretching out your arms. The cabin was one of 40 in the slave quarters, arranged in 2 rows with a central path between them, each structure housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people, depending on family size and Master Thornton's calculations about efficient space usage. Moses's grandmother, a woman everyone called Mama Z, had delivered more babies than she could count, her hands knowing by instinct and experience exactly how to guide new life into a world that would try to crush it from the first breath. His mother named him Moses because she said he had eyes that looked like they were searching for something beyond the horizon, eyes that might one day lead people somewhere better. Her name was Sarah, and she worked in the big house as a cook, a position that came with slightly better food and slightly less brutal working conditions, but also required constant vigilance against the sexual predation that house slaves faced from white men who considered black women property to be used however they pleased. Sarah had learned to be invisible, to move through rooms without being noticed, to speak in ways that suggested deference without actually offering any piece of her true self. She taught Moses this skill of protective invisibility from the time he could understand words. "Baby," she'd say, holding him close in the early morning darkness before she had to report to the kitchen. "You got to learn to disappear in plain sight. White folks look at us. They see what they want to see, nothing more. You give them that, but you keep yourself locked up tight inside where they can't touch it. Your mind is yours. Your heart is yours. They can take your labor and your time, but they can't have your soul unless you give it to them." Moses absorbed these lessons the way children absorb everything, not fully understanding but internalizing the survival strategies his mother was teaching. He learned to lower his eyes at the right moments, to speak in a slow drawl that suggested limited intelligence, to move in ways that seemed compliant and unthreatening. But behind this mask, his mind worked constantly, observing and cataloging and questioning everything he saw. She died of fever when he was 7, during one of the periodic outbreaks of disease that swept through the quarters when conditions became particularly unsanitary, or when Master Thornton's cost-cutting measures resulted in reduced food rations that weakened everyone's resistance to illness. Moses remembered the last morning she was able to get out of bed, how she'd held his face between her hands that were burning with fever, and told him to remember everything she'd taught him, to stay alive, no matter what it took, to never let them make him believe he was less than human. The plantation had no real medical care for slaves beyond a traveling doctor who came twice a year to check that Thornton's investments were in reasonable working condition. When slaves got sick, they either recovered on their own or died, their bodies buried in the unmarked plot beyond the rice fields, where the land was too swampy for cultivation. Sarah's body joined dozens of others there, and Moses learned early that hope was a dangerous thing to carry in a place like Greenwood. Hope could break you worse than any whip because hope implied a future that this place was designed to prevent. The rice fields were different from cotton plantations, requiring a knowledge of water management that made the work both more skilled and more brutal. Rice cultivation demanded constant attention to water levels, intricate understanding of drainage patterns, and the ability to read subtle signs in soil and plant growth that indicated when to flood or drain each paddy. The paddies had to be flooded at precise depths, the levees maintained with constant vigilance, and the harvest conducted while standing in water that bred mosquitoes thick enough to blacken the sky at dusk. Malaria and other waterborne diseases killed slaves regularly, but Master Thornton considered this an acceptable cost of doing business, simply purchasing new slaves to replace those who died. The work followed a brutal rhythm dictated by the rice's growth cycle. In early spring, enslaved workers prepared the fields, repairing levees damaged by winter weather, clearing debris from irrigation channels, and testing the gates that controlled water flow. This was backbreaking labor, hauling mud and timber to reinforce weak points, digging out channels that had silted over, working in cold water that numbed your legs and made every movement an exercise in endurance. Moses learned this work from the time he was old enough to carry a bucket, his small hands growing calloused from shovel handles, his feet learning to find purchase in slippery mud. Once the fields were prepared, planting began, slaves wading through ankle-deep water to press rice seeds into the mud at precise intervals. The work required bending constantly, straightening only to move to the next spot, your back screaming with pain by the end of each day. Children too young for field work brought water and food to those planting, and Moses remembered his years doing this, seeing the exhaustion etched into every face, understanding even then that this life was designed to use people up and discard them. After planting came the first flooding, raising water levels to depths that varied based on the rice variety and soil conditions. This was where specialized knowledge became crucial, and where Moses began learning the craft that would eventually define his life and lead him to freedom. His father, Justice, recognizing something in Moses's careful attention to detail, started teaching him the principles of water management that he'd learned over 30 years of rice cultivation. Justice explained that water was both tool and threat, that mastering it required understanding how it moved through soil, how temperature affected it, how plants responded to different depths and flooding durations. He showed Moses how to read the slight color changes in rice plants that indicated stress from too much or too little water, how to gauge soil saturation by its smell and texture, how to predict flooding needs based on weather patterns and seasonal changes. This knowledge was typically passed only to trusted slaves who'd proven themselves reliable over many years, because Master Thornton understood that water management skills gave slaves a form of power, the ability to damage crops through deliberate mismanagement if they chose rebellion over compliance. Moses absorbed everything his father taught him with an intensity that went beyond simple learning. He understood instinctively that knowledge was freedom, that the more he knew about the rice field's operation, the more valuable he became, and the more he understood about the system that enslaved him. He memorized the layout of every paddy, learned to calculate water volumes and flow rates in his head, practiced predicting exactly how long it would take to flood or drain each section based on gate positions and weather conditions. By age 10, he could manage simple irrigation tasks. By 12, he was assisting with complex flooding schedules. By 15, he was one of the most skilled water managers on Greenwood, his value to the plantation increasing even as his understanding of how to potentially resist grew deeper. Moses had grown up learning every trick of rice cultivation from his father, a man named Justice, who'd been sold away when Moses turned 12. The selling happened on a Tuesday morning in late summer, the kind of morning when the heat was already oppressive by sunrise, and you knew the day would be brutal. A slave trader arrived with 3 wagons, having negotiated with Master Thornton to purchase 6 slaves, Justice among them. Thornton had decided he needed cash more than he needed an aging rice worker, no matter how skilled, and Justice at 42 was considered past his prime years of productivity. Before Justice disappeared in the back of a trader's wagon, his hands chained to prevent escape, his face carefully blank to avoid showing the grief that would have earned him a beating, he'd pulled Moses aside behind the barn where they had 3 minutes of privacy before the trader's assistant came looking. In those 3 minutes, Justice whispered 3 things that would shape the rest of Moses's life, speaking quickly and quietly while gripping Moses's shoulders hard enough to bruise. First, learn everything about the water, because knowledge was the only thing they couldn't take from you. They could sell your body, work you until you dropped, beat you senseless, but what you knew stayed yours. Learn every channel, every gate, every quirk of every paddy. Learn it so well you could manage these fields blindfolded. Make yourself valuable enough that they need you, but never so valuable they fear you. Walk that line every day of your life. Second, never let them see you thinking, because a thinking slave was a dangerous slave. Master Thornton and men like him were terrified of slaves who showed intelligence, who asked questions, who seemed to understand more than they should. So hide your mind behind a mask of compliance. Speak slowly and simply. Act confused when it suits you. Let them think you're just a good worker, nothing more. But inside, think everything through. Question everything. Remember everything. Your mind is your weapon. Keep it sharp and keep it hidden. Third, marry for love if you got the chance, because love was the only revolution that mattered. They'd try to make you believe you were less than human, that your feelings and connections didn't matter. They'd sell your family, split up couples, take children from mothers, all while claiming it was just business. The only way to fight that was to love anyway, to build connections anyway, to claim your humanity through caring for others. Love was an act of resistance in a system designed to strip away everything that made you human. Moses had taken all three lessons to heart, carrying them like survival tools through the years that followed. He became, by age 20, the best water manager on Greenwood Plantation, a man who could read the flow of irrigation channels like some men read newspapers. He understood water pressure and soil saturation, could predict flood timing with uncanny accuracy, knew instinctively when a levee was about to fail or a gate needed adjustment. His skill made him valuable to Master Thornton, worth more than many field hands, given responsibilities that came with slight privileges, like occasional extra rations or permission to move around the plantation more freely than others. But Moses kept his intelligence hidden behind a mask of compliance, speaking in the slow, careful way that white folks expected, never meeting eyes directly, always yesing and no-siring at the right moments. When white people spoke to him, Moses's face showed nothing but patient attention to their words, no hint of the calculations running constantly through his mind. He perfected the art of appearing simple while thinking complex thoughts, of seeming grateful for scraps while planning methods of resistance, of acting content while rage burned cold and controlled in his chest. And when he met Ruth, a woman who'd been brought to Greenwood from a failing plantation in Alabama, he'd known within a week that he'd found his revolution. She arrived in early spring of 1852, part of a group of 4 slaves Master Thornton purchased at auction in Natchez. The plantation she'd come from had gone bankrupt after its owner died in a gambling debt crisis, and all its slaves were sold to pay creditors. Ruth had been separated from everything she knew, loaded onto a wagon with strangers, transported hundreds of miles to a new place where she knew no one and had no idea what to expect. Moses first saw her on her 3rd day at Greenwood, when she was assigned to his work crew in Paddy 2. She was small, barely over 5 feet tall, with hands that showed years of hard labor and eyes that held a wariness born of having lost too much. She worked without complaint, learning quickly the rhythms of rice cultivation, asking quiet questions about techniques that differed from what she'd known before. Moses found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing how she helped others in the crew without being asked, how she hummed quietly while working, how grief seemed to sit on her shoulders like a visible weight. He learned her story in fragments over the following weeks, conversations conducted in snatches during water breaks or in the brief period after work, when slaves had a few minutes before exhaustion claimed them. Ruth was small and fierce, with hands scarred from years of field work and a voice that could carry a hymn clear across the quarters on Sunday mornings. She'd been married before to a man named Daniel, lost her husband and baby to cholera in 1851 during an outbreak that killed 37 people on her former plantation. The baby, a daughter named Grace who'd been just 8 months old, died first. Daniel died 3 days later, and Ruth survived but told Moses she wasn't sure survival was actually a blessing. She carried that grief like a stone in her chest, something heavy and immovable that she'd learned to work around but never quite work through. Moses recognized the weight of it because he carried his own stones, memories of his mother dying when he was 7, his father being sold when he was 12, countless other losses, both large and small, that accumulated over a lifetime of enslavement. They understood each other's silences, the way trauma lived in your body even when you weren't actively thinking about it, how you learned to function while carrying unbearable weight because the alternative was giving up entirely. Moses courted her with a patience that surprised even him, understanding instinctively that Ruth needed time and gentleness after everything she'd lost. He brought her fresh fish he'd caught in the creek after dark, a dangerous activity since slaves weren't supposed to be out after curfew. But Moses knew which paths to take and which overseers would turn a blind eye. He wove her baskets from river cane he gathered on rare Sunday afternoons when work let up slightly, using techniques his grandmother had taught him before she died. He sat with her in silence when words seemed too heavy, just two people sharing space and breath, finding comfort in presence rather than conversation. He told her stories on the evenings when they could steal time together, stories about his mother and father, about the rice fields and their secrets, about small acts of resistance he'd witnessed over the years. He told her about Josiah, who'd slowed his work pace so expertly that overseers never caught him, but he accomplished 20% less than expected. He told her about Mama Z delivering babies and teaching mothers herbal medicine that kept children alive despite terrible conditions. He told her about the network of small rebellions that happened daily on plantations, visible only to those who knew where to look. Ruth eventually began telling her own stories, her voice quiet but steady as she described the life she'd lost. She talked about Daniel, how they'd fallen in love despite the impossibility of love in enslavement, how they'd dreamed of escape to the north but never found the courage or opportunity to attempt it. She talked about baby Grace, how she'd had Daniel's smile and Ruth's determination, how holding her daughter had been the only time Ruth felt completely present and hopeful since childhood. She talked about the cholera taking them both, how she'd been helpless to save either one, how she'd wanted to die too, but her body had stubbornly continued living. Moses listened to all of this without trying to fix or minimize her pain, understanding that some grief couldn't be comforted, only witnessed and honored. He told her honestly that he couldn't promise her safety or happiness, that the world they lived in was designed to take everything from them, but he could promise that he'd love her as completely as possible for however long they had. He told her that loving her felt like the only truly free choice he'd ever made, the only thing he'd chosen rather than had imposed on him, and that made it sacred regardless of what came after. They jumped the broom in the spring of 1854. With the whole quarter celebrating despite having nothing to celebrate with, understanding that a wedding was an act of defiance in a system that refused to legally recognize slave marriages. Master Thornton didn't care one way or another about slave relationships as long as they didn't interfere with productivity, so he gave permission for the ceremony with the same casual disregard he'd show approving a request to hold a funeral. The wedding happened on a Sunday afternoon, the one day of the week when work let up slightly, with Preacher Isaiah conducting the ceremony and everyone who could spare the time attending. Moses and Ruth stood before their community, holding hands while Preacher Isaiah spoke words about commitment and endurance and love being the one thing enslavement couldn't fully destroy if you protected it fiercely enough. They jumped over a broom someone had decorated with wildflowers and ribbons scrounged from God knows where, and everyone cheered as if this simple act represented victory over the system that tried to deny them humanity. That night, lying together in their cabin that was barely large enough for two people, Moses and Ruth talked about the future in whispers, allowing themselves to hope for small things like surviving another season together, maybe having children, if Ruth's body would allow it after what she'd lost, growing old side by side if the brutality of plantation life permitted such luxuries. For 2 years, Moses believed he'd found something worth protecting in a world designed to take everything away. He and Ruth built a life in the small spaces enslavement allowed, finding joy in moments that free people might overlook entirely. A shared meal of cornbread and greens, sitting together after work watching the sunset, humming harmonies to spirituals that spoke of freedom in coded language. Ruth's grief over her lost family never fully disappeared, but it became something she could carry without being crushed by it, integrated into who she was rather than defining her completely. Moses found in their relationship a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, understanding that protecting Ruth and building something with her was its own form of resistance against a system that wanted to reduce them both to units of labor. Clayton Briggs arrived at Greenwood in the fall of 1855, hired by Master William Thornton as the new overseer after old Crawford died of a stroke. Briggs was 32, lean and mean as a whipped dog, with pale eyes that looked like washed-out denim and hands that were never far from the whip he carried, coiled at his belt like a pet snake waiting to strike. He'd worked plantations in Georgia and South Carolina, building a reputation as a man who could squeeze extra productivity from slaves through a combination of fear, violence, and carefully calculated cruelty that went beyond simple brutality into something almost artistic in its precision. Master Thornton brought him in because rice prices were falling due to competition from Texas and Arkansas operations, and Greenwood needed to increase output to stay profitable in a changing agricultural market. Briggs came with references from 3 previous plantations, each praising his ability to improve productivity by 15 to 20% within the first year. What those references didn't mention was the cost in human suffering, the increased death rates from exhaustion and abuse, the broken spirits and destroyed families. They didn't mention the woman in Georgia who'd killed herself after Briggs raped her repeatedly, or the man in South Carolina who'd lost both his hands to infection after Briggs left him chained in the stocks for 3 days in summer heat. These stories traveled through the slave networks that connected plantations across the South, whispered warnings about overseers to watch out for, and Briggs's name was spoken with the same dread as diseases or natural disasters. From the first day Briggs walked through the quarters, Moses knew there would be trouble. The new overseer had a way of looking at the women that made Moses's jaw clench involuntarily. Had to consciously relax his face to avoid showing the rage that such looks provoked. It was a proprietary gaze that suggested he saw human beings as nothing more than assets to be used however he pleased, with no more consideration for their humanity than you'd give to livestock. Briggs moved through the quarters that first day like a man inspecting merchandise, commenting on people's physical condition, making crude jokes about breeding potential, touching women's arms and shoulders with a familiarity that was both threatening and disgusting. Briggs implemented a new work schedule that pushed everyone harder than they'd been pushed even under Crawford's regime, cutting the midday break from 1 hour to 40 minutes, extending morning start time to 30 minutes before sunrise instead of at sunrise, eliminating the brief rest periods that had previously been allowed during the hottest part of afternoon. He assigned tasks designed to humiliate as much as to produce, making elderly slaves do work that required agility they no longer possessed, forcing skilled workers to perform unskilled labor that wasted their expertise, creating competition between work crews that turned cooperation into rivalry. He seemed to take particular pleasure in breaking the spirit of anyone who showed independence or dignity, as if the mere existence of self-respect among enslaved people represented a personal insult to his authority. When Josiah, The older man, who'd perfected the art of strategic slowness, maintained his pace despite Briggs' demands for speed. The overseer had him whipped 30 lashes and then forced to work the rest of the day with a bleeding back, telling everyone within earshot that this was what happened to lazy workers who thought they could fool him. When a young woman named Sarah refused Briggs' advances, turning away when he tried to touch her breast during a work inspection, he had her sold within the week to a trader known for supplying brothels that catered to white men who enjoyed brutalizing black women. Moses kept his head down and his hands working, playing the role of the compliant slave with even more care than usual. Understanding that Briggs was looking for any excuse to assert dominance over someone respected in the community, he memorized every detail of Briggs's routine with the same attention he'd learned to apply to water management, treating the overseer as another system to understand and potentially manipulate. The overseer rose at 5 each morning, splashing his face with water from a basin kept on his porch, taking exactly 3 minutes for this ritual before beginning his day. He made his rounds through the fields by 6, following the same path each morning, checking work crews with a critical eye that found fault in everything. He took his lunch at the big house from noon to 1, eating with Master Thornton and his sons, discussing plantation business and drinking whiskey that loosened his tongue. Then he returned to supervise the afternoon work until sunset, his mood usually worse after drinking, his violence more unpredictable. He lived in the overseer's cottage near the main plantation road, a small wooden structure with a porch where he'd sit some evenings, drinking whiskey and cleaning his rifle, a new weapon he'd brought with him from South Carolina. The rifle was a source of pride for Briggs, custom made by a gunsmith in Charleston, with his initials carved into the stock. He'd sit there oiling the barrel and talking to himself about slaves who needed teaching, about keeping the animals in line, using language that made clear he didn't see the people he oversaw as human in any meaningful sense. Briggs was methodical in his cruelty, never acting on impulse, but always with calculated purpose, designed to maximize fear and compliance, while staying just within the bounds of what Master Thornton would tolerate. Thornton wasn't sentimental about slaves, but he understood they represented significant financial investment, and dead or permanently damaged slaves meant lost capital. So Briggs learned to calibrate his violence carefully, punishing hard enough to terrify, but usually stopping short of permanent harm, creating an atmosphere of constant threat that was in some ways worse than simple brutality because you never knew when or how the violence would manifest. Moses watched all of this with growing dread, understanding that Briggs represented a new level of danger to everyone in the quarters, but especially to anyone the overseer decided to target. He tried to make himself and Ruth as invisible as possible, which made him more dangerous than the hot-tempered overseers Moses had known before, men whose anger burned quick and hot, but then cooled. Briggs' anger was cold and persistent, and he never forgot a perceived slight or sign of resistance, storing up grievances to be paid back with interest when the opportunity arose. Ruth got pregnant in the winter of 1856, and Moses felt something shift inside him that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope exactly, because hope was still too dangerous to entertain in a place like Greenwood, but it was something adjacent to hope, a fierce protective instinct that made him stand a little straighter despite the risks that straightness brought. Ruth glowed with the pregnancy despite the harsh conditions, her small frame carrying their child like a secret promise that maybe, just maybe, there could be something beyond survival. For the first time in his life, Moses allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next day's endurance, picturing a child who might somehow, against all odds, grow up to see freedom. They talked about names in whispers at night, lying together in their cabin with Moses's hand resting gently on Ruth's growing belly. If it was a boy, Moses wanted to name him Justice, after his father, continuing a legacy that slavery had tried to break, but couldn't fully destroy. Ruth liked freedom better, saying every child born into bondage deserved a name that spoke of something better, a reminder that their current circumstances weren't permanent, even if they lasted a lifetime. They compromised, deciding freedom justice for a boy, grace hope for a girl, names that carried the weight of everything they'd lost and everything they still dared to dream about. Ruth's pregnancy progressed through the cold months of early 1857 with a mixture of joy and terror that Moses had never experienced before. Every morning she was able to rise and work felt like a small miracle. Every evening she returned to their cabin safely felt like a gift. Moses found himself praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, making bargains he knew were probably meaningless, but making them anyway. Let this child live. Let Ruth survive childbirth. Let us have this one thing, please. But Briggs noticed Ruth's pregnancy too, and Moses saw something change in the overseer's eyes when he looked at her, watched how his gaze lingered on her expanding belly with an expression Moses couldn't quite read, but instinctively feared. It wasn't desire exactly, more like resentment mixed with calculation, as if Ruth's coming motherhood represented some kind of defiance he needed to crush before it could inspire similar hopes in others. Pregnant slaves represented future property for the plantation, which meant they usually received at least marginally better treatment to protect Master Thornton's investment. But Briggs seemed to view this convention as a challenge to his authority, a suggestion that there were limits to his power over enslaved bodies that he found intolerable. Briggs started assigning Ruth the hardest tasks available for someone in her condition, sending her to clear irrigation ditches where the water was coldest and the work required constant bending and lifting. He made her work longer hours than other women in similar stages of pregnancy, finding excuses to keep her in the fields past the usual quitting time. He criticized her pace constantly, calling her lazy and useless, threatening to reduce her food rations if she couldn't keep up with workers who weren't carrying children. When Moses tried to intercede, suggesting gently that Ruth needed lighter duties given her pregnancy and the plantation's interest in protecting future property, Briggs' face had gone white with rage. The overseer ordered Moses stripped and tied to the whipping post, then delivered 20 lashes with a bullwhip, while forcing Ruth to watch every stroke. Moses had been whipped before, knew how to distance his mind from his body during the beating, but what made this particular punishment excruciating was seeing Ruth's face as she watched, seeing her flinch with every crack of the whip, knowing she blamed herself for his suffering, even though the fault lay entirely with Briggs' calculated cruelty. After the whipping, Moses couldn't work for 3 days while his back healed. 3 days of lost productivity that Briggs made sure to mention repeatedly to Master Thornton. The overseer framed Moses's intercession as insubordination rather than legitimate concern about protecting plantation property, suggesting that Moses was getting too big for his britches and needed reminding of his place. Thornton, more concerned about productivity than the welfare of any individual slave, accepted Briggs' version of events and warned Moses that future insubordination would result in sale. The rice fields required constant flooding and draining based on the growth stage of the crop, and Moses had spent years mastering the complex system of levees, gates, and channels that controlled water flow through Greenwood's paddies. There were 7 main paddies, each 15 acres, connected by a network of ditches that could be opened or closed using wooden gates controlled by iron wheels. The water came from the Tallahatchie River through a primary canal, then distributed through increasingly smaller channels until it reached each individual paddy. During growing season, the fields needed to be flooded to depths between 6 inches and 2 feet, depending on the rice variety and growth stage. Moses knew every gate, every weak point in every levee, every place where water tended to pool or drain too fast. He knew that Paddy 4 had a low spot on its eastern levee that would overflow if water rose more than 18 inches. He knew that the primary gate from the canal could stick if you turned it too fast, requiring you to climb down into the channel to manually adjust the mechanism. He knew that at midnight, when the plantation slept and only the night watch made his rounds every 2 hours, a man could open certain gates and flood certain paddies without anyone noticing until dawn. This knowledge lived in Moses's mind like a map, growing more detailed with each passing season. He'd never planned to weaponize this knowledge, but as Briggs' abuse of Ruth escalated through the spring of 1857, Moses began thinking about the rice fields differently. He started noticing details he'd overlooked before, like how the sound of rushing water could mask other sounds, or how a man could enter the paddies from 3 different directions, or how the mud along the irrigation channels was deep enough to swallow footprints. Ruth lost the baby on a Thursday in late April. She'd been working in Paddy 2, pulling weeds and water up to her knees, when the cramping started. Moses was in Paddy 5 when he heard her cry out, and he ran through the flooded fields with water splashing around his legs, knowing before he reached her what had happened. Ruth was kneeling in the muddy water, her skirt stained with blood, and her eyes held a grief so profound, Moses felt it like a physical blow. The other women helped her back to the quarters, but the damage was done. The baby, a boy Moses had secretly named Freedom in his mind, was gone. Briggs showed no remorse. When Master Thornton asked about the incident, the overseer said Ruth had been doing light work and must have had a weak constitution. He suggested selling her since she'd proven herself a poor breeder, discussing her value as casually as if debating the price of livestock. Master Thornton decided to keep Ruth, but Briggs made it clear through small cruelties that he considered her a waste of plantation resources. He assigned her the worst tasks, withheld her food rations, and made comments designed to remind her daily of her failure. Moses felt something break inside himself that he'd been carefully holding together since childhood. It wasn't a clean break, more like a slow cracking, the way levees fail when water pressure builds beyond their capacity to contain it. He continued playing his role, continued yesing and no siring, continued working with his usual skill. But beneath the surface, something had fundamentally shifted. He started thinking about the gates again, about midnight water, about how a man might drown if he found himself in a flooded paddy with no one to hear him call for help. The night of May 15th, 1857, was moonless and warm, with humidity so thick the air felt like damp cloth against Moses's skin. He'd spent the day working in Paddy 3, preparing it for the second flooding of the season, opening gates and checking levees with Briggs watching from the bank. The overseer had been in a foul mood all day, whipping 2 men for moving too slowly and threatening others with sale. Just before sunset, Briggs had called Ruth over and accused her of stealing food from the storehouse. A false charge everyone knew was meant purely to humiliate her. Moses had watched Briggs slap Ruth across the face, watched her fall into the mud, watched the overseer laugh at her tears. Something cold and clear had settled over Moses in that moment, a certainty that felt almost peaceful in its absoluteness. He knew what he was going to do, knew the cost, knew there would be no going back. But he also knew that some things were worth dying for, and Ruth's dignity was one of them. After dark, Moses lay beside Ruth in their cabin, listening to her breathe in the way people breathe when they're pretending to sleep. He memorized the sound, knowing he might never hear it again. Around 11, he rose silently and dressed in his oldest clothes, the ones stained beyond recognition with mud and rice chaff. He kissed Ruth's forehead, whispered words she probably didn't hear, and slipped out into the Mississippi night. The quarters were quiet except for the sound of crickets and the distant barking of plantation dogs. Moses moved between cabins like a shadow, heading not toward the paddies, but toward the overseer's cottage. He'd timed his move carefully, knowing the night watch would be at the far end of the plantation for another hour. The cottage sat dark against the darker sky, and Moses could hear Briggs snoring through the open window. Moses picked up a rock from the path and threw it hard against the cottage's far wall. The snoring stopped. A moment later, a lamp flickered to life inside, and Moses heard Briggs cursing as he stumbled toward the door. The overseer emerged onto the porch carrying his rifle, peering into the darkness with sleep-clouded eyes. Moses stepped into the pale lamplight just far enough to be recognized, then turned and ran toward the rice fields. He heard Briggs shout behind him, heard the man's boots pounding down the cottage steps. Moses ran fast, but not too fast, letting Briggs see him clearly, leading him deliberately toward Paddy 4. Behind him, the overseer's breathing came hard and angry, punctuated by curses and threats about what he'd do when he caught this runaway slave. Moses felt strangely calm, his feet finding the path between paddies without conscious thought, his mind clear as the water he'd spent a lifetime managing. Paddy 4 was flooded for the early growth stage, water standing about 15 inches deep across its entire 15-acre expanse. Moses splashed into the water without hesitation, heading toward the center of the paddy where the water was deepest. The mud sucked at his feet, and the rice plants brushed against his legs. Still small and tender this early in the season, he could hear Briggs splash into the water behind him, could hear the overseer's rage building with each step. Moses stopped in the middle of the paddy and turned to face Briggs. The overseer was 20 feet away, rifle raised, but apparently having second thoughts about shooting plantation property worth $1,200. Briggs lowered the gun slightly, breathing hard, and a cruel smile spread across his face in the darkness. "You think you can run from me, boy?" Briggs said, his voice carrying across the water. "You think you're special. I'm going to teach you what happens to slaves who forget their place. Going to whip you until you can't stand. Then I'm going to sell that wife of yours so far south you'll never even hear her name again." Moses said nothing, just stood there in the water, waiting. Briggs waded closer, the rifle now held loosely in one hand, clearly planning to beat Moses with his fists first. The overseer was 10 feet away when Moses spoke for the first time that night. "The gate's open." Moses said quietly. "Water's rising. Check your feet." Briggs looked down instinctively, and in that moment, Moses moved. He'd spent 25 years working rice fields, building strength in his legs that most men never developed, learning to move through water with a speed and certainty that came from absolute familiarity. He covered the distance between them in 3 splashing strides, hitting Briggs low and hard, driving the overseer backward into the deeper water near the paddy's center. The rifle flew from Briggs' hands, splashing somewhere in the darkness. The overseer tried to regain his footing, but Moses was on him, hands finding Briggs' throat, using his weight and leverage to drive the man down. They went under together, the water black and cold, full of mud and rice plants, and the accumulated sediment of seasons. Moses's hands stayed locked around Briggs's neck, feeling the man's pulse hammer against his palms. They surfaced together, both gasping, water streaming from their faces. Briggs tried to scream, but Moses pushed him under again, this time holding him down with a determination that felt almost peaceful in its clarity. The overseer fought hard, his hands clawing at Moses's arms, his body thrashing in the water. But Moses had wrestled full-grown hogs in these same paddies, had hauled 100-pound sacks of rice through waist-deep water, had built a strength that came from a lifetime of labor. Moses thought about Ruth while he held Briggs under, thought about their lost baby, about his mother who'd died hoping for something better, about his father Justice who'd been sold away, about every person he'd ever loved who'd been broken by a system that treated human beings like tools to be used and discarded. The anger he felt was cold rather than hot, focused rather than wild, and it gave him a clarity of purpose that felt almost holy. Briggs's struggles weakened. The thrashing became spasmodic, then stopped altogether. Moses held him under for another full minute, counting the seconds by his own heartbeat, making absolutely certain. When he finally released his grip, Briggs' body floated face down in the water, arms spread like he was trying to embrace the whole paddy. Moses stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, water dripping from his clothes. He could hear frogs calling from the banks, their voices rising in a chorus that seemed to echo his name. Moses, Moses, Moses. He wondered if that was real, or if he was already losing his mind. If the weight of what he'd done would break him before dawn came. He waded to the bank and found the wheel that controlled the gate between Paddy 4 and the main irrigation channel. Opening it fully would flood the paddy another foot by morning, making it look like Briggs had drowned accidentally while checking the water levels. Moses knew this wouldn't fool anyone for long, knew that a drowned overseer and a missing slave would tell their own story, but it might buy him a few hours' head start. Moses ran through the darkness toward the quarters, his clothes heavy with water, his hands still shaking from what they'd done. He found Ruth awake in their cabin, sitting on their bed with a bundle already packed. She looked at him and knew immediately, her eyes widening with understanding and fear, and something that might have been pride. "We have to go now," Moses said. "No time to explain. No time for goodbye. You trust me?" Ruth nodded, grabbing the bundle. They slipped out of the cabin and headed toward the woods that bordered Greenwood's northern edge. Behind them, Paddy 4 continued flooding, the water rising silently around Clayton Briggs' floating corpse, erasing footprints and evidence with each passing minute. Moses and Ruth moved through the forest with an urgency that made every snapped twig sound like thunder. Moses had prepared for this possibility, not expecting it but ready for it. and he'd hidden supplies at intervals along a route he'd memorized from whispered conversations with other slaves who'd attempted escape. There was a hollow oak 3 miles north with dried fish and hardtack wrapped in oilcloth. There was a creek bed they could follow west for 5 miles where dogs couldn't track them. There was a barn owned by a man whose sympathies ran against slavery, though approaching him was risky and would have to be done with extreme caution. The drinking gourd hung in the sky above them, that cluster of stars that pointed toward the North Star, toward freedom. Moses had studied it secretly for years, teaching himself to navigate by starlight the way his father had once taught him to navigate by water. They moved silently except for their breathing, Ruth keeping pace despite her exhaustion, both of them knowing that their lives depended on putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Greenwood before sunrise. They reached the hollow oak just as the sky began graying toward dawn. Moses retrieved the hidden supplies while Ruth sat on a fallen log, finally allowing herself to tremble with the reality of what they'd done. She looked at Moses in the growing light, saw the water stains on his clothes, the mud under his fingernails, the way his eyes held something new and terrible. "You killed him," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Moses nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Ruth stood and came to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 fugitive slaves holding each other in a Mississippi forest, while the world they'd known burned away behind them. The discovery of Briggs's body happened at first light when the field crews arrived at Paddy 4 to begin the day's work. They found the overseer floating face down in the now waist-deep water, his rifle lying in the mud nearby, his neck marked with bruises that the rising water hadn't washed away. One of the older slaves, a man named Josiah, was sent running to the big house to fetch Master Thornton. The master arrived within 20 minutes, followed by 3 of his adult sons and the plantation doctor. They pulled Briggs' body from the water and laid it on the bank, and even from a distance, the slaves could see the marks on the overseer's throat. Master Thornton's face went purple with rage, and he immediately ordered a count of all plantation slaves. The count came back 1 short of 247. Moses was missing. Then someone checked the quarters and found Ruth gone too. Master Thornton sent riders in 3 directions, messaged the county sheriff, and posted a reward of $300 for Moses's capture. The description circulated quickly through Mississippi and neighboring states. Moses, male slave, aged 25, approximately 6 feet tall, muscular build, skilled rice worker, considered extremely dangerous, killed white overseer, likely traveling with woman named Ruth, age 23, small build, reward increased to $500 for capture alive, 300 dead. But Moses and Ruth were already 20 miles away by the time those notices circulated. Moving through country Moses had studied mentally for years, from fragments of conversation and overheard directions. They traveled by night, hid by day, ate sparingly from their hidden supplies. Ruth's feet blistered and bled, but she never complained, understanding with the clarity of someone who'd lost everything twice that complaint was a luxury they couldn't afford. They crossed into Tennessee after 5 nights of travel, using a borrowed boat to navigate a river crossing they'd heard about through the slave grapevine. The man who helped them was an old black ferryman who asked no questions but whose eyes held a knowledge that spoke volumes. He gave them new clothes, pointing north, told them about a church 30 miles ahead where the preacher might help folks traveling to better circumstances. Moses and Ruth walked those 30 miles in 3 nights, arriving at the church exhausted and half-starved. The preacher, a thin white man with kind eyes and trembling hands, fed them in his cellar and explained the Underground Railroad in whispered words that sounded almost like prayer. There were safe houses, he said, secret routes, conductors who helped folks travel north to states where slavery couldn't touch them. It was dangerous. People got caught and killed, but it was possible. The preacher kept them hidden for 2 days while he made arrangements, then connected them with a conductor, a black woman named Harriet, who'd made the journey herself years before and now returned regularly to guide others. Harriet had a presence that commanded immediate respect, moving with a confidence that suggested she feared neither slave catchers nor death itself. She carried a pistol hidden in her skirts and told Moses directly that she'd shoot anyone who endangered her passengers through cowardice or foolishness. Moses and Ruth traveled with Harriet and 6 other fugitives through Tennessee and Kentucky, moving from safe house to safe house, hiding in barns and cellars and false-bottomed wagons. They crossed the Ohio River on a moonless night in late June, the water black and cold, reminding Moses of Paddy 4 and the choice he'd made that couldn't be unmade. When they reached the northern bank, stepping onto free soil for the first time in their lives, Ruth wept silently, and Moses felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since childhood. They settled eventually in a black community in Ohio, a place where former slaves built lives from fragments and determination. Moses found work as a laborer, then gradually as a water management consultant for farmers growing rice in reclaimed wetlands. His expertise, built through years of forced labor, became the foundation for a modest but independent life. Ruth worked as a seamstress, her scarred hands creating beauty from cloth, and in 1859 she gave birth to a daughter they named Freedom. But Mississippi didn't forget Moses, and the story of the slave who drowned his overseer in the rice floods became something of a legend in the quarters of Greenwood and surrounding plantations. The slaves whispered about him during work, sang coded songs about Moses, who led himself to freedom through deep water. Some said the frogs in Paddy 4 still croaked his name on dark nights. Others claimed you could see his footprints in the mud where he'd stood over Briggs' body, prints that wouldn't wash away no matter how many times they flooded the field. Master Thornton never recovered financially from the incident. The loss of both a skilled slave worth $1,200 and an experienced overseer created labor problems that cascaded through the plantation's operations. Rice production dropped, costs increased, and by 1860, Greenwood was losing money steadily. When the Civil War started in 1861, Thornton's sons went off to fight for the Confederacy, and within 2 years, the plantation was operating with a skeleton crew of elderly slaves and hired labor that couldn't match the productivity of the antebellum years. Moses heard about these developments through the networks that connected free black communities to those still enslaved. He heard when Greenwood burned in 1863, torched by Union forces moving through the Mississippi Delta. He heard when Master Thornton died of a stroke in 1864, leaving nothing but debts and bitter sons. He heard when the slaves of Greenwood were finally freed in 1865, walking away from the rice fields that had consumed their lives. Some of those freed slaves eventually made their way north, and a few found Moses in Ohio. They told him how Paddy 4 had been abandoned after his escape, how nobody wanted to work that particular field, how the frogs there grew louder and more insistent each spring. They told him the new overseer who replaced Briggs had quit after 3 months, claiming he heard voices in the water at night. They told him the field became known as Moses's Paddy. And even after emancipation, black farmers who tried to work it reported strange occurrences: the water rising when it shouldn't, the levees breaking without explanation, a sense of presence that made them uneasy. Moses listened to these stories with mixed feelings. He'd never wanted to become a legend, never sought to be remembered as the slave who drowned his overseer. What he'd done had been born of desperation and rage, and a love that demanded protection even at the cost of his own life. But he understood why the story persisted, why it mattered to people who'd spent their lives being told they were powerless. Sometimes stories were all you had, and a story about a man who chose violence over submission resonated in communities still processing generations of trauma. Ruth died in 1873, her body worn out at 39 by years of hard living and the lingering effects of plantation brutality. Moses buried her in a cemetery for black folks on the edge of their Ohio town, marking her grave with a stone that identified her as Ruth Freeman, beloved wife and mother. He never remarried, spending his remaining years working, raising freedom, and occasionally telling his story to young people who asked about the scars on his hands. Freedom grew up knowing her father had killed a man, knowing the circumstances, knowing the cost. Moses told her everything when she turned 16, sitting her down in their small kitchen and explaining in careful detail what had happened that night in Paddy 4. He wanted her to understand that violence was sometimes the only language oppressors understood, but also that violence carried consequences that lasted lifetimes. He wanted her to know that freedom was worth dying for, but living for it was harder and more important. Freedom became a teacher, educating freed slaves and their children, carrying forward the revolution of knowledge her grandfather Justice had believed in. She married and had children of her own, and Moses lived to see his grandchildren enter a world that was still brutally racist, but where they were born free. He died in 1888 at age 56, his body finally giving out from decades of hard labor. At his funeral, people came from 3 states, black folks who'd heard the story of Moses of Mississippi, who'd been inspired by his courage or comforted by his defiance. They sang spirituals that mentioned deep water and freedom, and someone told the story of how frogs still croaked his name in Mississippi rice fields. Freedom listened to these remembrances with tears streaming down her face, understanding that her father had become something larger than himself, a symbol of resistance that mattered to people who'd never met him. The story continued beyond Moses's death, evolving and changing as stories do. Some versions emphasized his skill as a water manager, casting him as a man who turned his master's tools against the system. Others focused on his love for Ruth, framing the drowning as an act of protective devotion. Still others portrayed him as a calculating revolutionary who'd planned Briggs's death for months. The truth, as Freedom knew, contained elements of all these versions, and none of them completely. Historians largely ignored Moses's story for decades, dismissing it as folklore or exaggeration. Slave resistance was systematically downplayed in official histories, the narrative of contented slaves waiting patiently for benevolent liberation, more comfortable for a nation trying to reconcile its past. But oral histories preserved the story, passing it through generations of black families, keeping alive the memory of a man who chose his own fate in a world designed to strip away all choice. The rice fields of Mississippi changed dramatically after emancipation. The plantation system collapsed, replaced eventually by smaller farms and different crop patterns. Paddy 4 at Greenwood was never successfully cultivated again, eventually reverting to wetland. The levees eroded, the irrigation channels filled with silt, and the land returned to something closer to its original state. But locals, both black and white, continued telling stories about the place, about strange sounds on dark nights, about water that seemed to move with purpose, about a presence that never quite left. In the 1920s, a folklorist from a northern university traveled through Mississippi collecting stories from elderly black residents who remembered slavery times. Several of them independently told versions of Moses's story, their accounts remarkably consistent despite geographic separation. The folklorist published these stories in an academic journal where they gathered dust for decades, read by almost no one, considered interesting artifacts rather than important history. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s brought renewed interest in stories of black resistance. Activists rediscovered Moses's story, seeing in it a proto-revolutionary narrative that challenged the myth of slave passivity. The story appeared in pamphlets and speeches, sometimes accurate, sometimes embellished, but always powerful in its central message that enslaved people had fought back in ways large and small against their oppression. Freedom's grandchildren, Moses's great-grandchildren, grew up knowing they descended from a man who'd killed for love and freedom. This knowledge shaped their identities in complex ways, filling them with pride but also with questions about violence, justice, and the costs of resistance. Some became activists themselves, drawing inspiration from their ancestors' courage. Others struggled with the weight of a legacy built on bloodshed, no matter how justified. In 1976, a group of black historians and community organizers placed a marker near the site of the former Greenwood plantation, acknowledging both its history as a site of enslavement and Moses's act of resistance. The marker sparked controversy, with some white locals objecting to what they saw as glorification of murder, while black residents insisted on the importance of telling complete and honest histories. The marker remained, weathering attempts at vandalism, becoming itself a kind of testament to the ongoing struggle over historical memory. Researchers eventually located records confirming the basic facts of Moses's story. County records showed an overseer named Clayton Briggs died at Greenwood Plantation on May 16, 1857, under suspicious circumstances. Slave registers showed a slave named Moses disappeared the same night, along with a woman named Ruth. Reward notices circulated through Mississippi and surrounding states, describing Moses as dangerous and armed. After that, the official record went silent, but census records from 1860 showed a Moses Freeman living in Ohio with a wife, Ruth, and an infant daughter. The physical evidence was even more compelling. When researchers surveyed the site of Paddy 4 in the 1980s, using ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis, they found traces of its original irrigation system, including the gate Moses had opened to flood the field. They found evidence that the gate had indeed been fully opened and left that way, consistent with Moses's reported method of creating a cover story. They even found traces of accelerated erosion patterns that suggested the Paddy had flooded beyond normal levels repeatedly after 1857, supporting local stories about the field's strange behavior. But the most interesting discovery came from environmental historians studying frog populations in Mississippi wetlands. They documented that Paddy 4, now a protected wetland, had unusually high frog populations compared to similar habitats, and that the frogs there displayed unique vocalization patterns. While researchers attributed this to specific environmental factors created by the site's history as a rice paddy, locals insisted it was something more, that the frogs were still calling Moses's name after all these years. Freedom's descendants gathered in Mississippi in 2007 for the 150th anniversary of Moses's escape, coming from across the country to visit the site where their ancestor had chosen freedom over submission. They stood on the banks of what had been Paddy 4, now a peaceful wetland full of reeds and birds and, yes, an extraordinary number of frogs. As the sun set and darkness gathered, the frogs began their evening chorus, and for a moment, everyone present could hear something that sounded almost like a name, repeated endlessly in the twilight. Moses's story ultimately represents something larger than one man's act of violence or one couple's escape to freedom. It speaks to the fundamental human drive toward dignity and autonomy, the lengths people will go to protect those they love, and the ways that resistance takes root even in the most oppressive systems. The rice fields of Mississippi were designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering, but they couldn't contain the human spirit's capacity for hope, love, and ultimately revolution. The water Moses knew so well, the water he manipulated with such skill, the water he used as weapon and escape route, flows still through the Mississippi Delta. It floods rice fields that are now worked by free farmers. Though the legacy of slavery continues shaping economic and social relationships in complex ways, the descendants of enslaved people still face systemic barriers built on foundations laid in slavery times, still fight for justice in systems designed to deny them full humanity. But they also carry forward stories like Moses's, stories that remind them their ancestors were never the passive victims history sometimes portrays. These stories function as both inspiration and warning, showing that resistance is possible but comes at tremendous cost. Moses gained his freedom but lost his homeland, his community, and ultimately his health, to the brutal labor that began in childhood. Ruth gained her freedom but lost her first child to plantation violence and her life to its lingering effects. Their daughter Freedom inherited both liberty and trauma, passing both to subsequent generations. The rice paddies where Moses worked have long since returned to wetland, but their history remains imprinted on the landscape and in the collective memory of those who know to look for it. Environmental historians note that disturbed landscapes carry traces of human activity for centuries, and the Mississippi Delta bears deep scars from plantation agriculture. The social landscape remains similarly marked, with inequality and injustice rooted in slavery's legacy, still shaping opportunities and outcomes. Yet stories like Moses's also demonstrate the resilience and resistance that persisted even under slavery's worst brutality. The slaves who whispered about him during work, who sang coded songs about deep water and freedom, who kept his memory alive through generations of oral tradition, were engaging in their own acts of resistance. By remembering Moses, they preserved knowledge of what was possible, maintained hope that justice could be seized, even when it was denied by law and custom. The frogs that supposedly called Moses's name have become in these stories something like witnesses, non-human testifiers to events that human systems tried to erase from official memory. Whether or not frogs actually vocalize anything resembling a human name is less important than what this element of the story represents. The idea that the natural world itself remembers and testifies to injustice, that some truths persist beyond human attempts to suppress them. Modern descendants of the slaves who worked Greenwood Plantation, including but not limited to Moses's own family, have complex relationships with this history. Some find power and pride in stories of resistance like Moses's. Others feel the weight of inherited trauma, the ways that violence and loss echo through generations. Most feel some combination of both, understanding that their ancestors were simultaneously victims of terrible oppression and agents of their own resistance, people who made choices within impossibly constrained circumstances. The question of violence in Moses's story remains controversial and thought-provoking. Was he justified in drowning Clayton Briggs? Most would say yes. Given Briggs' brutality and the lack of any legal recourse for enslaved people to protect themselves or their families. But Moses himself seemed to understand that justification doesn't erase consequences, that taking a life changes the person who does it regardless of circumstances. He carried that knowledge to his grave, passing to his daughter not pride in violence, but understanding of its necessity in certain terrible moments. This nuance often gets lost in simplified retellings that cast Moses as either hero or murderer, without room for the complicated truth that he was both and neither. He was a man pushed past endurance by a system designed to break him, who found in extremity a capacity for violence he'd suppressed for 25 years, who used that violence to protect someone he loved and to claim freedom he'd been denied since birth. Trying to judge his actions outside the context of slavery's absolute horror misses the point entirely. The rice fields of Mississippi where Moses worked, where he killed Clayton Briggs, where he began his journey to freedom, exist now in a state of partial recovery. The land bears scars from intensive plantation agriculture, and full ecological recovery, if it's even possible, will take centuries. Similarly, the social and economic structures built on slavery's foundation persist in modified forms, requiring ongoing work to dismantle. Moses's story reminds us that such work is necessary, that systems of oppression don't fade without active resistance. In the end, Moses of Mississippi matters not because his story is unique. There were countless acts of slave resistance, both violent and nonviolent, throughout slavery's existence, but because it was remembered and passed forward, someone knew his name. Someone preserved the details. Someone understood that a slave who drowned his overseer in the rice floods at midnight was making a choice that reverberated beyond individual survival into something like collective liberation. The frogs that supposedly called his name were never really frogs at all, but the voices of those who refused to let his story die, who understood that remembering is itself an act of resistance. Moses Freeman died in Ohio in 1888, 56 years old. Body worn but spirit unbroken, his daughter Freedom stood beside his grave and told her children about their grandfather, about the rice fields of Mississippi, about the night he chose freedom over submission. She told them about Paddy 4 and the deep water and the man who never stood up again after Moses put him down. She told them about the frogs whose voices carried into the darkness, witnesses to justice claimed through violence, in a world that offered no other path. And somewhere in Mississippi, in a wetland that used to be a rice paddy where enslaved people worked themselves to death for another man's profit, frogs called out into the night air, their voices rising in chorus. sounding to those who knew the story like a name repeated endlessly. Moses, 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 testimony and remembrance and promise all at once, reminding anyone who'd listened that resistance was possible, that freedom could be seized, that some stories refuse to be drowned no matter how deep the water rises.